Welcome. I'm Brian Brees, President of St. Norbert College. It is my honor to kick off the second of 3 virtual pre-summit events leading up to the in-person New North Summit on June 10th. I've been involved with the New North as a current board member and chair of the Business Intelligence Council, along with Dave Wegge, whom you'll hear from shortly. Throughout today's event, you'll learn more about developments that have occurred across the New North region, even during a pandemic, how the New North Launch Alliance is working hard to create a more connected and robust entrepreneurial ecosystem in Northeast Wisconsin. You'll hear from 3 local founders and learn about the Business Intelligence Council's work with COVID-19 scenario exploration. It's now my great honor to introduce to you Barb Lemieux, President of the New North.
Thank you, Brian. We very much value your leadership across our region. We know 2020 certainly served up its share of challenges, but our region is resilient. While there is still work to be done, we are seeing great signs of recovery. This is due in large part to how local communities across our 18-county region responded throughout the pandemic. We are incredibly grateful to our local partners, our communities, and our businesses for all of their efforts to help our region get back on the road to recovery. We produced a short video to highlight a sampling of development projects in 2020. Large and small, we are proud of them all.
New North created the New Launch Alliance to create a more connected, robust, resourceful, and productive entrepreneurial ecosystem in Northeast Wisconsin. We realize that a strong strategy for the region's recovery is being led by creative business ideas that are turned into companies, especially in digital technology. As part of the alliance, for example, a team of corporate innovators from various companies in the region have come together to share ideas, mentor entrepreneurs, and enhance our entrepreneurial reputation. Business idea pitch contests were hosted, and new avenues for capital are being developed. We are pleased to bring you 3 winners of the recently held New Launch Alliance regional pitch events and thank WBD, Brightstar, and C.D. Smith for their sponsorship. We also thank our many local partners who helped in the coordination of local contests, all helping to create the energy and connectedness of players in our ecosystem. First, you will hear from Andrew Schmitz, founder and CEO of Proceed.app. This business creates a modern solution for retaining and sharing institutional knowledge of an organization. As an app, it allows for the sharing of information during the onboarding process for new employees, training sessions, and more. Employees are encouraged to capture what they know firsthand. Rich visual documentation is created on the app with simple updates. Next, you will hear from Sean Robinson, founder of Pure and Complete Phonics, LLC. The startup is developing an engaging, game-based spelling and reading application for students with dyslexia that is authentic, realistic, and culturally responsive. Last but not least, you will hear from Stephanie Hoskins, co-founder with her husband Houston of Dettel. This business model is tackling the consumer debt crisis by helping companies and their customers negotiate and settle overdue invoices through a cloud-based platform, scalable to any business size that automates, improves, and simplifies the negotiation of bad debt accounts.
Hey everyone, I'm Andrew Schmitz. I'm the co-founder of Proceed.app, an Appleton-based startup. I'm honored to be presenting to you today as a 2019 Hatch Pitch Competition finalist. If you remember my pitch from 2019, I was a guy who started on stage saying, employee turnover sucks, and we help make it suck less. Our journey through the last year has been remarkable, but now that we've actually launched our product and we have customers, I can tell you with certainty that we actually do help make employee turnover suck less. And additionally, we help with a lot of other workforce challenges, including capturing institutional knowledge from employees before they retire, improving work floor efficiency, safety, and compliance by increasing knowledge accessibility, and my favorite, helping companies navigate through language barriers and literacy barriers while training new employees. How do we do all this? If you don't recall, Proceed.app is a visual knowledge management system used mainly by companies with an on-the-go workforce like manufacturing companies and distribution centers. They use our app to create and distribute SOPs, on-the-job training content, work guides, safety instructions, and other forms of operational documentation using amazing visuals. Why visuals? Well, it really shouldn't surprise you, but the common stat that's out there is that 65% of humans identify with having a visual learning preference, which means that there's a really good chance that 65% of your employees also have a visual learning preference. And so that's why we created Proceed.app, to help businesses say goodbye to their text-based binders that are collecting dust and hello to amazing visual-based content that aligns to how the majority of their workforce prefers to learn new information. We focus on 3 main things at Proceed.app. First, making it super easy to capture your processes and knowledge with bite-sized photo and video-based content. Secondly, rapid distribution, getting the right knowledge to the right people at the right time conveniently. And last but not least is continuous improvement through data-driven decisions. But that's enough about us. I want to talk about you for a second. After the Hatch Pitch Competition, like every other business, we were welcomed by a worldwide pandemic. And yet, through all the change, we had an exciting year of growth, and largely because of your support. The extra cash from winning the pitch competition is great, But the true prize was the social capital given to us by all of you. Your generosity and willingness to support homegrown startups with your connections and your expertise was paramount to our success thus far, and I really can't thank you enough for your continued support. I want to congratulate this year's winners of the Hatch Pitch Competition, Dettel and Dr. Dyslexia Dude. These two companies are great examples of shining startups coming right here from Wisconsin, and I really look forward to following their growth as a fellow entrepreneur. Today is a great day to be a startup, and especially a great day to be a startup in the New North. Thank you for your time, and take care.
My name is Dr. Sean Anthony Robinson, and I'm a co-founder of Dr. Dyslexia Dude with my wife, Dr. Inshira Robinson. Before I begin, I'd like to share about who I am and why we made Dr. Dyslexia Dude. None of my success would be here without Dr. Robert T. Nash, who first diagnosed me with dyslexia at the age of 18 when I first started to read at the University of Wisconsin-Oshkosh. Through this time, it's been my mission to help students find their place in the educational system and have a voice and give them hope. And Dr. Dyslexia Dude is doing that. We want to give students across all nationalities, across the world, hope, allow them to see themselves as being superheroes within their own selves, and allow themselves to be successful. So none of my success, from going to Northwestern, presenting at Jamaica, Canada, to the White House, to NBC News, none of that would have been able to happen without Dr. Robert T. Nash diagnosing me with dyslexia. So this work is really to serve kids and allow them to see themselves as being successful within the context of school and their learning. We are developing a multimedia company that's going to develop graphic novels, online content, and game-based learning for students 4th through 8th grade with dyslexia that is authentic, realistic, and culturally responsive. Our 5-year vision is to develop curriculum, again, that's authentic, realistic, and culturally responsive, enhance our brand, graphic novels that come in Turkish, Arabic, Spanish, and Braille for those who are visually impaired. Also the game-based learning and workshops and online content through media. Our vision, step 1, is develop the curriculum. It's done. Enhance our brand. We continue to work on that. Our graphic novels are in progress. We're working on our 3rd graphic novel now. That's going to be decoding dyslexia to help students understand how to crack the code in terms of their reading and spelling abilities. We're also developing an app, an interactive learning experience for those who want to engage in online learning. And we're developing a website that has dashboards, ebooks, and animations, and also continue to do interactive workshops globally. Our new game-based learning app with multi-sensory instruction will be focused on auditory, emotional, visual, speaking, and touch, and allow students to build their own avatar so they feel part of the game. Traction. We have already developed a wireframe prototype with feedback. We're doing ongoing testing with customers. 90% of reviewers said that the game will help students learn how to decode and encode words. And 90% of reviewers believe that this game will be an effective supplemental tool for students in 4th through 8th grade to help them with their decoding and encoding ability. Why now? Education institutions have been unprepared to fulfill the learning of students effective through virtual learning options. There's a need for quality game-based learning that delivers authentic, realistic, and culturally responsive content. Now more than ever in our history, we need the ability to better reach students in special education and those from underserved and underrepresented communities through books, online learning, and things that are relevant to them. Our team, Dr. Dyslexia Dude, my wife, Dr. Inshira Robinson, Mike Beal, Brendan Hadnot, and Dr. Kitts, and Dr. McGregory are part of our team. If you'd like to know more information, please contact me at drdyslexiadude@gmail.com. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Stephanie Hoskins. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Dettel. Dettel is on a mission to tackle the consumer debt crisis. Every year, 93% of all businesses will see at least one customer who cannot pay an invoice. And 30 million Americans have at least one bad debt reported to their credit records annually. Combined, they pay a total of $13 billion in fees to debt collectors. Prior to Dettel, it was very inefficient for an organization to try to negotiate one-on-one with each individual customer. Some organizations have thousands of bad debt accounts, like hospitals and utility companies. And to try to negotiate with every single individual can be very difficult and time-consuming. And then what we also noticed is that consumers are less willing to try to settle a debt unless they can get that put in writing first. But a lot of traditional collection methods refuse to put that in writing until the consumer has paid. And so this causes the breakdown with the process. Dettle solves these two major inefficiencies. So Dettle is a business-to-business cloud-based software that automates, improves, and simplifies the negotiation and settlement of overdue customer invoices and bad debt accounts. So our automation and improvement to the process enables corporations and organizations to negotiate directly with thousands of individual accounts efficiently and like never before. We also address that transparency and trust issue by ensuring that both parties are protected and secure throughout the process, and both knowing that they will receive exactly what they need to from the transaction. Dettle has several competitive advantages over the status quo of collections. One is that we're incredibly easy to implement. You can sign up for an account with Dettle and be inviting your bad debts to settle within 10 minutes. We're also less expensive than traditional collection methods and very consumer friendly. So the outcome for our clients is that they increase their revenues and decrease their expenses. They're able to collect more from their accounts receivable and offer more flexible options. They also improve their customer relationships so they can salvage those good reviews and referrals and even future revenue from those customers. We're excited to have implemented our pilot program at several initial sites, and we have expanded beyond those initial beta and pilot sites, and we're launching and scaling in several various industries. Our leadership team consists of myself, my co-founder and husband, Houston Hoskins, and our tech lead, Raphael Spencer. I have over a decade of experience in corporate finance and strategy. Houston is an expert in business development and customer relationships, and Raphael is a full-stack senior software developer with countless projects under his belt, including fintech integrations and experience directly with our tech stack. Since we won the New North Pitch competition, we were able to use those funds to hire our tech lead and implement improvements to Dettle. We were then able to use that momentum and progress to secure a spot in a nationally ranked accelerator program. So we're currently participating in the Excel Prize Accelerator, which goes through May. We then were able to close our pre-seed round, and now we have completed our pilot program, and we are in the process of launching and scaling Dettle through various industries. Our ask today is that if any of y'all watching this are interested in reaching out and getting to know us, we would love to expand our network in our new home of Wisconsin. We moved here from New Orleans in July, and so far we've really enjoyed just plugging into the local entrepreneurial ecosystem and getting to know so many Wisconsin entrepreneurs and people around the space. Also, if you have any introductions to innovative companies who would like to work with a Wisconsin-based startup, we would love to meet those people. We're looking forward to meeting everybody in person and are excited for the June event. Thank you.
It's now my honor to introduce to you Dr. Dave Wegge, President of the Bay Area Community Council and co-chair of the New North Business Intelligence Council. This is a group of thought leaders who inform stakeholders across the 18-county region on data trends, advanced disruptive technologies, digital transformation applications, and most recently, the integration of data into a newly formed Intel tracker.
Thank you, Brian. I want to welcome all of you and thank you for including this presentation in your day. The Business Intelligence Council, or BIC, was created to provide insights from ongoing data, trends, analysis of our regional economy. The primary purpose of our presentation today is to take a quick look at how the New North economy has performed through the pandemic. Let me take a minute to set the stage. In August of 2019, BIC brought together leaders in business, nonprofits, government, and education to engage in a scenario planning session led by David Burrell of Future IQ. That session produced 4 plausible scenarios for the future of the New North economy. 6 months later, in early 2020, we were hit with the COVID-19 pandemic. Faced with the pandemic, BIC then spent some time reviewing the original scenario report, as well as examining some scenario planning recommendations made by Deloitte's Monitor Institute. That led us to ask, how has the New North performed during the pandemic? What successes have we had? What challenges still lay ahead? In order to shed some light on these questions, let me give you a brief overview of the preferred future that emerged from our planning session. Many of you may have participated in the scenario planning session or may have read the full report, so the scenario matrix may look familiar. There are 2 primary dimensions to the scenarios. The vertical dimension represents digital transformation from having a single technology approach to a connected systems approach. The horizontal dimension represents our workforce and workplace transformation from having a workforce that is rooted, homegrown, and a workplace that is transformed by remote work, which produces broader opportunities for participation. The upper right quadrant, the New North leading disruption, emerged as the preferred scenario for the future. The characteristics of the New North leading disruption are digital transformation. We would have a regional investment in digital transformation and technology. Our regional industries would be collaborative. We'd have a strong ability to innovate and adapt to technological change. And the region would be highly connected, both digitally and globally. Our workforce would be transformed as well. We would have a radical reinvention of the workplace. The workplace would be made up of talented individuals who are diverse and attracted to our region. We would have a support network of workforce and workplace solutions. And we would be able to assess the future skill needs that we have and train people for those needs. So the question is, where are we now? How has the pandemic impacted the economy in the New North? What progress have we made in the midst of the pandemic? What are some of the challenges that we still face? And should we be focused on in moving forward? We are fortunate to have Dr. Mark Schaefer with us to help us answer some of these questions. Dr. Schaefer is the director of the Center for Business and Economic Analysis at the Schneider School of Business at St. Norbert College. Welcome, Mark.
Thanks, Dr. Wege, and it's a pleasure to be here to talk with you all today. I'm going to be talking a little bit over the next 20-25 minutes or so about an important topic, obviously, of what's going on in our current region, and that is the pandemic, the economy, and specifically what's been happening in the New North as a result. To lay out some of my comments, I'm going to be talking a little about a brief COVID-19 update, followed by economic performance and resiliency, and then we'll be talking a little about the household experience and followed up with probably the most important part of the presentation today, which is sort of talking about our path ahead. What do some future scenarios look like, and what are those challenges that are still on the horizon for us? To start off with, COVID-19 cases fortunately have been falling recently in the state of Wisconsin, along with most parts of the country. The good news is actually we're at relative lows compared to where we were, many months ago in the peak of the pandemic. And the current forecasts on the CDC show they're expected to be at these low levels for the foreseeable future. In terms of Wisconsin vaccinations, this is also an area that's seen a lot of good progress lately. You might be surprised to know that actually as of March 28th, and I say March 28th because this data changes on a daily basis, Wisconsin was actually ranked #1 in the country in terms of the percentage of COVID-19 vaccines administered relative to those distributed. Essentially what this means is we're doing a really good job of not wasting any vaccine that's distributed to our region. In fact, as of March 28th, that was showing in and around about 93.7 or 94%. And as of the end of March, we're seeing about nearly 30% of the population has received at least one dose of the vaccine. We're going to be talking about the impact that all of this is going to have on the economy, and the COVID-19 situation and these vaccines are going to play an important part of what that future holds. One last note in terms of COVID-19 updates, it's important to realize that the experience of this pandemic has varied greatly across households and even in so much as who's been impacted from a health perspective across various races. What we can actually see in the visual here, and this is Wisconsin data, we can actually see that American Indians and Black and Hispanics have actually seen different impacts in terms of case rates, in terms of hospitalization rates, and in terms of death rates. It's an important thing to note, even as we talk about what this looks like moving forward, that these experiences of the pandemic are very, very different, and that's going to play a role in our recovery. Switching gears now, let's talk a little about what's happened in the economy, specifically how it's performed and how resilient our region has been in the face of these challenges. So the key slide here that I think sets up a lot of the presentation is to look at what's happened in our region, in the state, and in the United States as a result of the pandemic. So this is a graph that sort of outlines what's been happening from the perspective of employment and employment growth. So the data you're looking at here for the United States and Wisconsin is essentially the non-farm total employment data. And I've indexed it back to January of 2019 to 100. And what we're looking at is sort of the cumulative growth relative to where we are now compared to January of 2019. And it's clear from this visual that you see this significant drop-off that's occurred in April of 2020 when the lockdowns went into effect. And you saw whether it was Wisconsin, whether it was the United States, or even the last data on there for the North, you see all of these tend to trend together where we see that significant drop-off in employment. Following sort of the initial lockdowns, when we started to slide into summer, we see some of this growth start to return, although it's well short of what we saw back in January of 2019. Now, the important thing to note in this visual is I've also added some data from the local area unemployment statistics and compiled an estimate of what's been happening in the New North in terms of employment. I indexed it to January of 2019 as well. What we can see is it follows a similar trend line of the state and the United States, but the upside for the New North is we've seen our rebound happen a little bit faster. And we see the initial bump up in May, June, July. Our rebound was faster than the state, faster United States, and we've kind of leveled off. We're still short of sort of where we were prior to this pandemic and prior to this crisis, but we are faring a little bit better than Wisconsin and the rest of the state. Now, if we're going to talk about employment, we also need to talk about unemployment, and we can see the same sort of pattern exhibited here. Here you're actually seeing what were the unemployment rates for the United States as well as for Wisconsin. And one of the things we noticed is prior to the pandemic, we were actually at near historic lows for unemployment rates. And then we hit the pandemic and we had this sudden surge of unemployment claims. And we actually went from the mid 3% up to about 14.7% unemployment nationally in the span of a couple of weeks, which is significant. Fortunately, a lot of those jobs have come back and unemployment has fallen down to about 6.3% nationally. However, we still have a long way to go because that's still about 3%, 3 percentage points higher than where we were prior to the pandemic. The good news for us in Wisconsin is while we did experience the same run-ups that the rest of the country did, our sort of recovery has been a little bit faster. And we're hovering now at about 3.8% unemployment, which is much lower than what we've seen for the nation. And that speaks very well to our prospects and how the recovery across the state has been for us here. This resiliency is also seen when we look at job postings. So here's a quick take at what's been happening in terms of the posting of jobs both nationally as well as in Wisconsin. And this is one of those new high-frequency data series that we've been tracking to get a better sense of what's been happening. And all of this is relative to the beginning of 2020. So what we're seeing is the percentage change relative to that period. And while we see Wisconsin as well as the rest of the country had that huge drop off in job postings, we see it's kind of bounced around a little bit through 2020, but towards the latter half, what we see is Wisconsin started to post jobs at a slightly higher rate than the rest of the country. In so much that even most recently in the last quarter of data that we're looking at here, you can see that we're pushing, north of about 30% increase in and above what we were posting prior to the pandemic, which is good news for us in Wisconsin. Now, this rolls over specifically if you want to focus on manufacturing, which all of us know is an important industry within our region and within the state. If we look at the same data for job postings, we see the same relationship holds, only that manufacturing job postings have actually increased at an even faster rate than the rest of jobs, pushing north of 40% given the most recent data we have. This speaks very well in explaining what's been happening within our region. Specifically, if we actually want to look at some of the data, we can actually look, and this is using some data from EMSI, and we can look at the percentage of the workforce nationally that's made up of manufacturing workers, and it's typically around about 7.9% or 8% of workers tend to be in this sector. If you look at data on the New North most recently, this is closer to actually about north of 20%, about 23% of our workforce is somehow linked to and tied to manufacturing. If we think back to the earlier graph that we saw about how the New North had a nice recovery during this crisis, we can actually point some of that to what's been happening in the manufacturing sector. One of the reasons why we may have performed as well and come back as much as we have is because manufacturing is indeed an essential industry that we've relied on heavily throughout the pandemic for a host of different reasons, and that probably has played an important role in helping us rebound a little bit faster than the rest of the state in this context, as well as the rest of the country. In looking at other variables that we can explore to get a sense for how the New North is faring, we can actually look at what's been happening in the hospitality sector. So here's some data that we can look at where we're looking at sales tax receipts in the accommodations and restaurants sector. And what we can see here, and most of us know this, that this is a sector that definitely has had a hard go of it as of late, given a lot of people have been avoiding restaurants, avoiding vacations and travel. If you look across the state, sales tax receipts are down about 27% from 2019 to 2020. If you look at the New North, it was only down about 21%. So of course, down 20% is not a good thing. However, we are faring a little bit better in this category compared to the rest of the state. Sliding over and look at our spending in our region from tax receipts in terms of retail trade, we can see this has been up a good amount for both the state as well as for the New North. Both of them are in and around up about 10%. And this speaks to a lot of what's been happening as consumers have substituted away from some of the trips and some of the restaurants that they've been going to and put more of that money into buying things in the retail sector. And you can see it's up 10% year over year, and even the New North is actually up just a hair more than the rest of the state, which speaks to some of our behavior and how we've been trending with the state, as well as maybe outperforming a little bit in this area. If you want to shift gears and talk a little bit about the experience of the business community, that also ties to the conversation about resiliency. Here's some interesting data from the U.S. Census Bureau's Small Business Pulse Survey, and this is from this past March 2021. And they asked small businesses the question, overall, how has this business been affected by the coronavirus pandemic? And what we see here is obviously across the state as well as across the country, negative effects are more the norm here. So there's large negative effects felt both in the state as well as the broader country, as well as moderate negative effects as well. The upside here is that we've had a little bit less businesses impacted from the large negative effects side. The country was showing about 28%, in Wisconsin closer to 25%, so that's relatively good news for us. But that's made up a little bit because we've had a little bit more in the moderate negative effect category, about 48% to about 44%. So that bodes well for us as a state, comparatively speaking. The one thing on this slide that strikes me as very interesting, though, is look at what's happened in the moderate positive effect side. You can actually see that nationally, 5.8 or about 6% of small businesses said they've actually experienced somewhat of a moderate positive effect as a result of the pandemic. And it's even higher for Wisconsin, pointing to about 8%. Now, we can think of some businesses that were well positioned to actually provide products or possibly alter their production lines to provide products that were necessary and needed during the pandemic. And these are businesses that actually probably thrived a little bit as a result. Now, it's worth noting, this sounds very optimistic, like things are great in Wisconsin because we're doing better than the national average. But we got to be very clear. This is all not necessarily good news. Okay, we still have, nearly 75% of our small businesses have experienced at least a moderate negative effect or a large negative effect as a result of what's happened. So while, again, relatively speaking, we can say this is good for Wisconsin, we still have a lot of businesses that are facing a lot of challenges that we can't ignore and need to make a focal point for success in the future. Now I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about the household experience. As I mentioned before, the whole experience of COVID-19 has varied greatly across different types of industry sectors, across different types of households. If households had children or didn't have children, had to worry about school closures, across households that had workers in specific industries that were impacted, such as tourism or hospitality. So what we want to do now is have a brief conversation about what have different households experienced and how they've been affected. So here's some data from the Household Pulse Survey. This is also recently created by the U.S. Census Bureau. And this is a weekly survey that they're running, and they've changed the questions throughout the pandemic. And this is from this past March. And this is just a series of questions I've presented data on that look at different challenges that households have faced. And they basically were surveying them to figure out if households have had difficulty paying household expenses, challenges with food scarcity, challenges with housing insecurity, or even challenges with eviction or foreclosure. So this is, again, data from this most recent March, asking questions about if any of these households have experienced these things throughout the pandemic. And what we can see here is across the United States, about a third of households have indicated they've had some challenge paying these expenses. About 10% have had challenges with food scarcity, about 7% housing insecurity, and nearly a third, about 32%, definitely are talking about issues with eviction and foreclosure as possible things in their future. Now, all of that is not good news. The one optimistic side is for Wisconsin, we're pretty much lower in every single one of these categories. Again, that's a good thing. However, it's important to be clear, saying that we still have 30% of households struggle paying regular expenses is not a good thing. We still have challenges with food scarcity, still have challenges with housing insecurity. So while we have a long way to go, and there's some optimism here, we still have to pay attention to the needs of the families and households within our region and the state. Another interesting trend we've noticed, and many of us may have experienced throughout this pandemic, is some of the challenges we've seen at the workplace, specifically in the context of telework and remote work. A lot of us had some challenges maybe quickly where we had to adjust because of some lockdown situation where we had to somehow figure out how to manage doing our job from the household. And if you look nationally, there's some interesting data, again from the same survey that I just referenced, of sort of what's happening in Wisconsin as it pertains to this telework. So nationally, about 39% of workers have suggested that their households have had one or potentially both of the incomers in the household switch to some kind of telework at some point throughout the pandemic. We're right near there for Wisconsin at about 36%. So we're right in line with the national average. Just for context, sort of on the high end of our scale here, you got DC. About 61% of households experienced some exposure to telework throughout the crisis in DC, and that ranges all the way down to about the high 20%, 26, 27% of Mississippi there at the bottom. Now, what's particularly interesting about the telework component, which is why I want to spend some time talking about it, is this is actually one of those things that has had a differential impact on households. If you start to break out the data by income in terms of households that were able to actually respond to telework needs, what you quickly see is there's a very important distinction about incomes that households make and their ability to do remote work. In fact, on the data we're showing here, what you're seeing is in the gray responding yes to this question, and the green responding no. These are essentially the same thing about how households have been able to respond to telework. And you clearly see above sort of about $75,000 in the households, those households had a much easier time transitioning to telework. And at households that were bringing in less than about $75,000, this was a much more difficult thing to be able to do. And when you start to think about the types of jobs that might tie to some of these income differentials, this might make some sense. So we might broadly think that maybe higher income jobs might be tied to white collar office type jobs. Those are the jobs that were much easier to transition to telework. Whereas, let's say you have industries that are service-based industries or people that work in hospitality or restaurants. You can't do those jobs from home. And if those fall in the lower income areas, we can basically look at this graph and suggest that higher income households were able to better weather the storm from an income perspective than those lower income households. This is an important trend to note, highlighting that households have had very different experiences. We can also talk about, if you overlay the same data in terms of education, the same thing holds if you start to look at bachelor's degree holders and higher had a much easier time transitioning to telework relative to non-bachelor's degree holders. So the household experience is really marked by different type of challenges that every household has faced. One last comment to address in talking about the household experience before we move on to some scenario conversation is looking a little bit at New North mobility. This is an interesting data set that I'm showing here. It's actually a partnership between the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas and a company called SafeGraph. They have access to some anonymous geolocation cell phone data. And what they've actually been doing throughout the pandemic is tracking the frequency with which people are moving around with their cell phones. So it's really a measure of mobility. And what you can see, and this whole thing is benchmarked to January of 2020, prior to the crisis, what we can basically see is people largely dropped off their mobility going into the crisis, and we see the huge lockdown effect that happened in this data. And we quickly see a bit of a rebound to a new normal there, sort of late summer moving forward. The thing that's interesting to me about this graph is while Wisconsin generally has trended closely to the U.S. in terms of mobility, what you do see is the New North has trended a little bit higher in terms of mobility, and most notably sort of in 2021, it's actually trended significantly higher, I would say, compared to Wisconsin, United States. And this could actually align to some of the recent changes we've seen in terms of the resiliency of our region, people going out spending money, our rebound's a little bit stronger. Now that we've done sort of a brief overview of what's been happening in the economy sort of in the state and in the region, now let's shift gears and talk a little bit about the future ahead. What does the future look like for Wisconsin? What does the future look like for the New North? So I want to revisit this image that we looked at before, where we actually looked at the path to recovery compared across the New North, Wisconsin, and the United States. And what I've done here is sort of outline 3 possible growth rate trajectories. Now, to be very clear, these aren't actual legitimate forecasts. These are just sort of trend lines I stuck on there for conversation purposes. Don't go making bets on the numbers you're seeing on here. We just want to talk about some trend lines across 3 possible scenarios we could see moving forward for the New North. So for the first scenario, which I kind of think of here as sort of the lowest likelihood scenario from my perspective, think of this as the case where we have some sort of COVID-19 resurgence and there's sort of an economic pullback that results. So of course there's a conversation in Wisconsin how as we already talked about here, cases are down, vaccination rollout looks pretty promising here in the state. All of that is good news. Of course, we never know. There's conversation right now about new potential COVID variants and what that could do. So hypothetically, suppose we did have a situation where the COVID-19 cases started to spike back up and we saw people sort of retreat to being more cautious again. What would this look like in our region? Well, this is sort of in my perspective, the worst case scenario of the 3 scenarios we're talking about. That would sort of lean to a little bit more of an economic pullback, right? A pullback in spending in those hospitality type sectors, restaurant sectors, et cetera. And then also we'd see substitution effects where that spending would be redirected more towards some of the retail sectors that we just talked about. Additionally, if we had any economic inequality challenges or problems like low-income workers, for example, or disenfranchised workers, or possibly households with children that have a harder time doing dual incomes in that case, those would be magnified under this scenario as challenges moving forward. I view this as sort of the longest recovery path because if we got knocked off where we were as of right now, or where we are as of right now, it's going to be a longer path to get us back to where we were prior to the pandemic. For the second scenario, which I kind of view here as sort of the moderate to high likelihood scenario, I'm kind of calling this the status quo with some optimism. So, as of right now, where we are within the year, we're in March, April, we've been in the pandemic for a year, cases are low, vaccination looks good, people are actually somewhat optimistic for the future. We're looking forward to a summer, good weather, can be outdoors. This is where we start to see cases stabilize, optimism resumes, some of that spending comes back, maybe in those sectors of tourism and hospitality. They see a small resurgence in activity. But I think the important thing to realize is even with all that optimism, you're still going to have varying opinions on comfort level and safety level that every family is going to have to take on as we move towards our recovery. So while some of this is going to come back, you might have a lot of folks that are still very cautious and not willing to, let's say, take the whole family of 5 out to dinner on a Saturday night in a restaurant. I think that's going to be something that's going to take a while for everybody to get on the same page and feel comfortable with. And until everyone's 100% comfortable, we're probably not going to see a full-blown recovery. This is why I'm kind of viewing this option as sort of the status quo with some optimism. Now that brings us to sort of scenario number 3, which is moderate to low likelihood for me, maybe a little bit more on the low likelihood side, but this is sort of the best case scenario. COVID-19 cases drop to near zero, vaccination rollout goes well, everyone feels very, very comfortable, let's say throughout the summer, moving into the fall. Everything's full-blown reopened, everyone's willing to spend exactly like they were prior to the pandemic. All the behaviors were exactly as they were prior to the pandemic. And that's going to bode very, very well because arguably speaking, there's probably a lot of pent-up demand for things like vacations, et cetera, that haven't happened for many families over the course of at least a year. This would sort of be the fast recovery bounce back scenario to pre-COVID levels, let's say by end of summer, early fall. So these would be sort of the 3 outlined scenarios that I'm kind of laying out. So what are some factors that are going to contribute to these future scenarios? Or is there some sort of version of these scenarios that we could consider to be blended? So here's a list of things that I'm thinking about that I consider factors that are going to contribute to these scenarios. So the first and obviously most important one, which is underscoring this entire conversation, is What is the situation with COVID-19 and vaccinations, and how does that translate into consumer sentiment, and specifically how comfortable all households feel to resume their behaviors? That's going to be probably the single most important thing that dictates which scenario we end up in. However, there's a host of other considerations that are also extremely relevant into driving us into preferred possible scenarios. So some other things to consider are sort of the regional and social cooperation across stakeholders. We're fortunate in our region to have organizations like the New North that have the support of many, many firms and businesses and local governments in our region, all working together to try and find solutions to help us in normal times as well as through the pandemic times. Some of the efforts, which I'll discuss in a later slide here in a moment, some of those efforts have actually helped us excel throughout the pandemic. And that type of cooperation, that cohesiveness bodes well for the region. We've already talked a little about economic resiliency and adaptability. We have many firms in our area that have been able to actually take what's happened in the pandemic, maybe change supply chain situations, possibly even change their products to best serve the country as well as the region. You know, our ability to respond to those changes, and we've already done a lot of that so far in the pandemic, assuming we can continue to do that, that's also going to bode well for our future. I think shifting gears and talking about business resiliency is also an extremely important topic because while, again, many of our businesses have been very resilient, we can't also ignore the fact that a lot of businesses have definitely struggled throughout this crisis. We have businesses that maybe were here a year ago that are no longer here now. So depending on what that looks like in the future moving forward and how we can actually do things to support businesses that have either struggled or possibly businesses that have closed to reopen, what does that landscape look like moving forward? The more things we can do to help that, the more likelihood we are to slide into sort of a scenario 2 or possibly a scenario 3 type situation. I think the other two areas that I think are important to focus on is what's been happening in terms of technology. I think all of us have been able to sort of look at how we use technology in our day-to-day life and specifically in our workplace and how that possibly has adjusted or changed throughout this crisis. And I think the other thing to consider is how that rolls over into how adaptable our workforce has been. And if our workforce, especially those that have possibly been disenfranchised or lost their jobs because of certain industries that they worked in, how are we able to help those workers possibly retool, get new skills, and find new jobs in our region? All of that is going to be important to take into consideration when we start to think about which scenario we end up in this case. To put this into some context, I want to revisit that small business pulse survey one more time from the U.S. Census. And a recent question they asked was, in the next 6 months, do you think this business will need to do any of the following? And they asked them a list of essentially things that the business might be looking at in terms of investing in or needing to do in the near future. And I'm showing this table because essentially I think the top result for the state of Wisconsin is probably the single most important thing on this slide, and that is that nearly 40% or 38.6% of the small businesses said their number one focal point in the next 6 months is to identify and hire new employees. That speaks very well to our recovery here in Wisconsin, and if that's what firms and businesses are thinking about doing, this is going to be an important thing for us to discuss in terms of our workforce, what that looks like and how we can help to support that effort. Another thing to sort of reiterate coming from the technology perspective is to sort of tie this back to some of Dr. Wage's comments earlier about the New North and some of the scenario planning that was done earlier. As part of that effort, the New North actually conducted a survey where they looked at sort of the preparedness of firms to handle future challenges. And they asked a list of possible concerns for the future. I just pulled out a subset of that list, specifically the ones that sort of ranked high in terms of companies not feeling comfortable or prepared to handle certain tasks. So here's a snapshot of those items. And what we see as you scan the list quickly, I kind of group it in sort of two categories. One category is prepared in terms of technology. So we look at how are firms able and ready to cope with AI, predictive analytics, possibly disruptive technologies, and even company organization orientation towards technology. And we see prior to the pandemic, this is in 2019, companies were already ranking this in and above 50%, or in some cases up to 72% in terms of how they did not feel prepared to handle this. And in many ways, we could make the case that the COVID-19 pandemic actually magnified and accelerated the importance of the role of technology in the workplace. And this is something that happened, again, pre-pandemic, that I think we really have explored a lot throughout the pandemic, and we're working to integrate even more so currently and moving forward towards the future. I think this all ties down to what are the challenges ahead then based on these conversations. We talked about these factors driving scenarios, and I think it's important to reiterate those briefly in the context of some of the existing efforts of what's happening. So the first two considerations, they kind of stand alone. That's what happens with COVID, what happens with vaccines, and what happens to consumer sentiment. So if we look at the next block of things, regional social cooperation, economic resiliency, business resiliency, adoption and implementation of new technologies, all of these in some way or another can have some connection to the importance of integrating technology into what it is we do. And I'm bringing that up because, as Dr. Wege alluded to earlier, one of the preferred scenario characteristics that they identified in the scenario planning prior to all of this stuff happening was the role of digital transformation in the region. What is the regional investment that's happening to support these efforts? How are regional industries being collaborative to maybe advance some of these technological skills and capabilities? What is our ability to innovate? And how is the region connected digitally as well as globally as a result? And as I mentioned, the COVID-19 pandemic has definitely magnified the importance of this. But I think we can't underscore how the efforts that were already happening can help actually push us out of this crisis and set us up even better for the future. If you slide down to these, the next set of topics I've highlighted, some of the same topics are highlighted here in terms of cooperation, resiliency, as well as workforce adaptability, training, and inclusion. And all of these actually tie very nicely to the second characteristic that was outlined in the scenario planning, which is the importance of workforce and workplace transformation. So a lot of what we need to think about is how ready and capable is our workforce to adapt to the changing environment, specifically if we're going to talk about integrating technology. You know, is our workforce talented, diverse? How do we attract talented, diverse people to the region? How do we take our existing talents and skills and upskill them even more? What network do we have to support these efforts? And what steps are we taking to assess future skill needs and possibly implement training to better prepare our workforce for the needs of our businesses within our communities? Now, what I want to touch on to sort of round out the comments here is I want to bring it back a little bit to the New North, which is why we're all here talking today about this playbook to recovery, and talk about some of the initiatives that they've actually undergone as it pertains to digital transformation, as well as workforce and workplace transformation, which, as I discussed, is an important thing, generally speaking, as well as pulling us out of this pandemic. There's been great efforts in the space of digital transformation, specifically around upskilling, specifically targeting those that actually have been negatively impacted as a result of the pandemic. There's a great program that was a collaboration between the New North Generator and Microsoft. Even Thrivent was involved to basically build out a program of LinkedIn modules to actually help workers upskill, get certificates, and get better skill and ability to better serve our local businesses in the region. There also is a great effort going on right now as part of the new Manufacturing Alliance and the new Digital Alliance, where they're taking steps to promote digital skills training, both through K through 12 education and beyond, to again better satisfy the needs of the businesses in our region. From the workforce and workplace transformation area, there's been great steps for diversity, equity, inclusion. Belonging action items is something they've been working on. And this spans the gamut from helping firms explore different diverse supply chain type options, to emerging leader programs, to even seed accelerator type programs that are designed for entrepreneurs of color. These are all initiatives that the New North has been involved in that are helping not only pull us out of the pandemic, but also I think things that we know we need even if we're in a world without the pandemic. So these are all great initiatives that are happening. One of the things, as we talked about the importance of technology and telework, is initiatives for broadband access for all. A lot of us might take this for granted, but there's still large parts of our state that don't have access to broadband. This is an important initiative, and New North has actually worked with local counties to try and identify what areas are still lacking in this area and what efforts can we actually push forward to help provide solutions to this challenge. And one of the last areas to mention of the many things that they do is talk about local solutions to the supply chain. In particular, they've done great work even throughout the pandemic to assist firms in locating new suppliers for products. If they had to quickly transition to, say, making PPE, where could they actually get some of the products they needed to produce those things? So the New North has really been a powerhouse behind the scenes of helping us drive through the challenges we've experienced over the past year. Thank you for taking the time to join me for this conversation today. Hopefully some of this information was helpful and was insightful. A couple of things I'd like to mention here as I close. One, if any of this information was relevant or interesting and you want to get more information about what's been happening in the region, I would encourage you to go check out the New North's Intel Tracker. The Business Intelligence Council of New North has gone through great effort to actually put a mountain of resources on there, from everything from economics to employment to social factors about our region that can help with your decision-making process. The last thing I'll close with is keep your eyes open. There's a partnership between the New North, St. Norbert's Center for Business and Economic Analysis, and the Wisconsin Department of Revenue. We gave one of these events actually back in December, and there's another event coming up here May 19th. It's going to be an economic intelligence update. We'll take a deeper dive into the state and regional economic statistics about where we are, and talk about highlighting some important industries moving forward. Thank you again for joining me.
So what's next? Our May 12th Education and Talent Attraction Training Camp will focus on best practices on upskilling and talent attraction methods, work of the industry alliances, and a real estate forecast as it relates to places where talent will work. Our main event on June 10th will feature our offense, which describes a company that is growing. This will be provided by Kim Bassett, President and CEO of Bassett Mechanical. Dr. Andrabi, President and CEO of ThedaCare, will give his perspective on defense, representing an industry that has risen to the challenges of caring for COVID-19 patients. Michelle Schuler of TechSpark Wisconsin at Microsoft and Joe Kurgis of Generator will focus on special teams as they discuss the Generator Upskilling Initiative. Our keynote, Tim Moore, is a 3-time Emmy Award-winning director. His message to us will be a reflection on the resiliency of our region during this pandemic, the power of social impact, and inspirational messages of not giving up. As a curious-driven entrepreneur, Tim became a leading expert in purpose-driven marketing over the last decade and has developed emotionally compelling campaigns for brands all around the world. You all will receive a copy of his book, Sold on Purpose, Compliments of NWTC and Performa. And we will keep you all in suspense to announce the Workplace Excellence Award winner presented by Right Management. Wrapping up the summit will be a high school drumline competition, so stay tuned. That brings the session to a close, but you will not want to miss the virtual networking that immediately follows. We thank Insight Publications for providing this forum through their Meetaway platform. Just click on the link that was previously sent to you to continue our dialogue. Our thanks to Coalesce for this production and to Image Studios for their technical support of today's event.
You know, the benefit of attending a New North event, especially in person, is the networking with other attendees. So it's an honor for Insight to partner with New North to provide the Insight Meetaway networking portion of today's event. All attendees are welcome to join by using the link in the chat or the link that was emailed to you this morning. Even if you haven't gone in already to set up your attendee profile or your networking preferences, that's okay. It can be done quickly, easily. Just follow the prompts and start matching with others through a series of one-on-one video calls. So use the link with your laptop or desktop. Enjoy the virtual networking to close out today's event. I look forward to seeing you there.